Hello and welcome to this live broadcast by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. My name is Colin Webster and I am the host in this conversation. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation is leading the charge toward a circular economy, an economic system that's restorative and regenerative by design. And as such, one thing we're interested in is the food system. Now, the food system is, by many accounts, in a state of disarray, and there's much need for a transformation of how the entire system works. Now, my two guests in this show thinks that there is an appetite for change and there's no lack of ideas, no lack of great ideas indeed out there about what we can do about this broken food system. Joining me in this conversation over the next 45 minutes will be Christine Gold, who is the founder and CEO of Thought for Food, who consider themselves the world's entrepreneurial engine for food and agriculture. And also Christina Agrapakis, who is the creative director at Ginkgo Bioworks. And Christina once made cheese using bacteria from the human body. Maybe we'll hear about that later. This is an online and interactive session, which means that you can put your questions and thoughts into us using the comments section on the page you're watching this on. So please put your comments in there and various people will send them right to me in this iPad and I'll make sure that those questions go to our guests. We're going to kick off with Christine Gold from Thought for Food. Christine, I said there's problems within our food system. Just briefly, could you outline what those problems are?
Yeah, thanks, Colin. It's a pleasure to be here tonight and look forward to receiving questions from the audience. There's many problems with our food systems. First of all, we live in a world where there's, nearly a billion people who are hungry or malnourished. And this number is actually on the rise again for the first time in a decade. We also have on the very same planet a billion people who are suffering from obesity and all of the related health effects that come with that. In addition, we're stretching our planetary resources to their very limits, overusing things like water, depleting our soils and encroaching on biodiversity. We have 1/3 of our food that is wasted either on the farm or by consumers. The other thing that I think is really important is that we treat our food system as if it's, one big system, when in fact it's a, multitude of systems that are working together and related to all of the other global challenges that we face as a human species. And so kind of when we talk about the food system, it's erroneous, in my opinion, to talk about it as a singular system or as something that we can treat in isolation. It's a lot of systems and diverse locations around the world that are interlinked with all of the other systems and topics that we face as a species and in our environment. So those are some of the challenges that we have to tackle, which make things difficult, but also a lot of fun. So that's why I'm here and where I focus my energies.
Yeah, it's a great reminder of this interconnectedness of everything, which is certainly a stance that chimes with us. But you've chosen to work in food and agriculture. Could you just tell us what it is that you're doing to play your part in rejuvenating the food system?
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, I've spent like my entire career actually working in the agricultural part of our, food value chain. I grew up on a farm myself. And when I was working for a big multinational corporation in Europe, and I had the chance to travel the world and kind of see all kinds of discussions happening about the future of 2050, where we're going to have 10 billion people living on the planet, and what does our future look like and how we're going to feed people, I noticed that there was like a key demographic missing from the discussions. And that was the very people who would be alive in 2050. After attending so many of these meetings, I really took it upon myself to say, I need to do something about this. How can I bring the voices of the next generations into this topic and into developing the solutions that their future depends on? So I launched an organization called Thought for Food, which, as you said, is the world's innovation engine for food and agriculture. What we do is we focus on empowering millennials and Gen Zs to build purpose-driven startups in diverse locations around the world. We're working in 175 countries, and we empower them through a global community, through a digital and virtual acceleration program, and through investments in their startups that we make. We run a program called the Thought for Food Challenge, which is the leading incentive prize competition in food and ag. We organize the TFF Global Summit, which brings together all kinds of amazing innovators, creatives, and people who are thinking about the future to really inspire each other and co-create the solutions that we need, which need to break us out of this traditional mindset of looking at things in singular silo systems, and rather as these interconnected and interrelated topics, where we all need to be crossing traditional boundaries to solve. And it's actually, I had the chance to meet and work with Christina, our other speaker, as a result of this. So it's such a pleasure to be reconnected here tonight.
And what's when you set the challenge with Thought for Food? What is the challenge you're putting in front of people? What are they trying to solve?
Well, the challenge they're trying to solve is this macro challenge of like, how are we going to feed 10 billion people by 2050? And that's a big, massive question with a lot of component parts into it. So what we do is, we equip them with the skills and mindsets to break that question into solution spaces that are relevant for them in the, locations that they're coming from. So much because of the particularities of, for example, agriculture, and like I said, these food systems and how they work. There's cultural issues at play, and kind of local aspects that need to be taken into consideration. What we do is we really try to foster people to build these solutions from the ground up. And so much in the past of what we've seen is like technology looking for a solution and looking to scale itself globally. But what we really need in food and agriculture is market relevant solutions. So we really try to empower that. And then what we do is also, because we're working with young people who are digital natives and they're naturally collaborative, is we foster a global community and support system that's working with these innovators wherever you are in the world to share knowledge and know-how and best practices, and even hardware blueprints and open source enabling technologies, so that we can accelerate the speed of innovation and reduce duplicative efforts. So it's this global approach, but we think that that's really, really important for how we're going to solve big, complex, and nuanced challenges like the food systems challenges that we face.
So you think that the future of the food system is less likely to be homogenous, and the scale comes through that diversity and localized solutions?
Absolutely. I
And you
like the way you put that.
you talked there about people collaborating across geographies. This is a big thing for you in Thought for Food, isn't it? That lots of people would be working together. Can you tell us why you think this is part of the solution?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think that there's, I've spent a lot of my career in the innovation space. And what we see is that there's a lot of, duplicative innovation that happens. But through kind of this ethos, which has transformed other sectors, such as software and even music, we've seen that through openness and collaboration, you can accelerate the speed and impact of beneficial innovation. So we are trying to foster that type of culture in agriculture and in the food tech innovation. And I want to just make sure that when I talk about this, I'm not talking about piracy or freeware, and people like stealing each other's ideas. Like open source is something we do a lot of exploring around, but there's still like governance around open source. Like I said, it's more around finding new ways to kind of share enabling technologies and know-how and best practices, as well as finding new types of business models that don't just focus on winner takes all, but rather around the broader sharing of benefits when value is when value is created. And these are like new in this space, but we've seen the precedent in other sectors. So we're saying to ourselves, let's explore that here, because we believe that the future is going to be around more integration of technologies to create transformative impact for growers, and like what you so astutely articulated, this kind of like looking at scale through a local lens, right? And like how you can scale like impact through more openness and sharing.
Yeah, it's really interesting you use the software Silicon Valley metaphor, which I think we're going to hear a bit more from Christina when we come to her too. But there'll be people wondering, give us some examples. Like, tell us some of the success stories that you've come across down the years.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things come to mind, and I want to say that like SynBio, I think is like such a great example of a space that has really embraced this like open and collaborative culture. But like one example that comes to mind is a team that we are working with in Colombia. They have developed a kind of ag tech data-driven marketplace for growers in their country, and they've actually, taken some of the data that they're working with and made it anonymous and also available for participants in our TFF challenge to use. We've also partnered with an organization called Wiki Factory, which is focused on providing open source blueprints for technologies that can be applied in areas like drones and urban farming. And then another example that's very specifically related to SynBio, which I think is a great segue into Christina, is a team that we worked with. We found them actually through a global SynBio science competition called iGEM, which is an amazing organization for your audience to check out. And we worked with them to take their science research and turn this into a startup. And their startup was really focused on identifying naturally occurring microorganisms that had beneficial nutritional properties. And what they were doing was adding those microbes into starter cultures for fermented foods, such as yogurts and breads and even beers, ostensibly. And they were open sourcing, right, these starter cultures, because in the cultures where these founders were from, namely India and Pakistan, there was a big sharing culture amongst home cooks and their own mothers, right, of these kind of starter cultures for homemade fermented foods. So they wanted to like capture that in their business model, and that was really exciting for us because again, it was like spreading the benefits of their innovation in a way that was relevant for their cultures and not just like this winner takes all, total IP protection. And they were able to like build a really interesting story and business model that allowed them to explore that.
We'll come to Christine in just a second, but why do you think the winner takes all model, as you put it, do you think that's going to become defunct, or do you think this is just another way of doing business, this open source sharing?
Well, I think we're at like a paradigm shift in the world. So, what I see in my work with millennials and Gen Zs around the world is that business as usual has failed them, and they are coming, kind of hardwired with a new way of thinking about things and working. And so, for example, because they're digital natives, they're like more open minded than previous generations, they're more naturally collaborative, they're also sustainability natives. They've grown up seeing the negative externalities that business as usual has caused, and so they come like with this like mindset of putting purpose first, and kind of at the core of how they do business. And now they're taking leadership positions, right, and they're coming in and starting these impact focused businesses. And the issue is that, like I said, we're in this like transition point where there's a risk that they can be tricked back into the system, right, of like a traditional investor paradigm of like, what's your IP? How are you cutting off competition versus what the way that they want to do business, which is, more focused on like impact and fostering new types of business models. So I think where we are right now and what TFF is trying to do is give them this space to explore those places and provide, some support funding, et cetera. And a large part of it is also going to be around, sharing their story in a compelling way to consumers who also want to see big shifts in the food system. And the other little last point I want to make before you go to Christina is that the other thing that I really noticed, and I'd love to hear her thoughts on this, is that with the young people around the world that we're working with, they, as part of their open mindedness, they also tend to be naturally open to the benefits of synbio and science based solutions in a way that there used to be these kind of polarized discussions around. And this is like, we're moving past that with the next generation. So they're looking for new types of business models and new types of conversations around solutions in the food space.
Back to you soon, but you've set us up very nicely for Christina. Christina Agapakis, You are the creative director at Ginkgo Bioworks, and looking at the description of Ginkgo Bioworks online, it tells us you design custom microbes for customers across multiple markets, developing new organisms that replace technology with biology. Who are your customers, and what exactly is it you're producing for them?
Uh, Great question. So I think it would be useful, I think, probably to like back up a little bit and explain a little bit more about the technology and what it is that we're building at Ginkgo. Um, I think Christine mentioned this, like there, or you were talking about this, like there is this kind of like analogy to sort of Silicon Valley to computers that's been useful in synthetic biology and really helped shape the community of what people are thinking about. It's not a perfect analogy, like biology is not a computer in many ways, but I think it is useful to sort of make sense of what we're trying to do. That analogy really comes down to the idea that inside of biology, inside of living things, there's DNA. That DNA is kind of like a code, right? It encodes the functions of the cell, and it's actually a code that's we can read and write. And so, like molecular biology, synthetic biology is all about building the tools to be able to read and write DNA and really write new kinds of programs and be able to work with biology to do new things. And so Ginkgo is really about building the platform with tools to do that better and faster and cheaper to like open up the possibility of what's possible to do with biology. And so when you look at what our customers and the kinds of things that we do today, that kind of really crosses a lot of different industries, a lot of different approaches and a lot of different places about where biology can start kind of being redesigned to be to influence different kinds of supply chains and places. So in agriculture, we have a joint venture called Join Bio with Bayer, the German company, life sciences company, and that Join is really focused on engineering bacteria that live in the soil to be able to develop more sustainable solutions for growers. One of the major projects that they're doing is working with bacteria and trying to engineer them to produce fertilizer for plants. So you don't have to add chemical fertilizer or as much chemical fertilizer, which causes a lot of environmental damage, whether it's in the runoff or in the like greenhouse gas emitted during the production. So that's one particular example where you can reprogram that DNA of those microbes that live in the soil, where they can start, using the nitrogen in the air and helping give it that to plants. And then there's other projects that we're doing, other customers, in whether it's pharma, working with another company called Synlogic, doing a similar thing, but not in plants, but in the gut. Can we engineer the bacteria that live in our bodies and have them act really as living medicines in this really kind of smart way in our body, where they're programmed to respond to conditions in the body and treat disease. So that's two very different examples, but kind of gives you a sense of ways that biology can be deployed in different places.
I think it was a great overview. Thanks for that. You must get asked a lot about people's disquiet about the idea of engineering something that we put into our soils, that we put into our guts. What's your standard response to people when they come to you with these concerns?
I think Christine put it really well, right? I think that there's well, she didn't say it exactly this way, but I would say that often when I think scientists, like we come from this position of saying like, oh, people don't understand the technology, they're afraid of the new technologies. I don't think that that's actually what at the heart of it. I think it's not that people don't like technology; it's that they don't like capitalism, or that like capitalism is not really working for them, or like they feel like these companies don't really have their best interests at heart. They're not doing things right by the environment or their communities, and so the question really is like, are there different kinds of business models? Are there different kinds of communities? Are there different kinds of ways of developing a technology that's going to work better for people and for the environment? And so, yeah, when I think about genetic engineering, like I'm a genetic engineer. That's my training. So like I do things like this, like I make stickers to say like I think that genetic engineering is going to make a huge positive impact, but it'll only be able to do that if we have the right kind of community and the right kind of context for it, right? And if we're thinking deeply and in this really, if we're thinking deeply about the problems that we're trying to solve, and we're not kind of reproducing the same kinds of status quo that's not working, just with a new kind of technology. And so the question is like, how can we make genetic engineering, how can we make GMOs that people love, rather than how can we convince people to love GMOs as they are today?
So, I mean, obviously, you're at the forefront of helping people to love them and being a bit provocative, perhaps, with the stick. And we saw this front cover of The Economist. It's got pictures, not so much about or synthetic biology, pictures of cows with zebra stripes and parrots with long necks. Does this type of approach, do you think it helps the public understand what synthetic biology is all about, or does it hinder in any way?
I think it's provocative. I think it helps start a conversation. I don't think that if you read the article inside The Economist, you'd get the sense that the companies working in synthetic biology today are trying to make cows with zebra stripes. But I think it does sort of it starts that conversation of like, oh, synthetic biology is about programming biology. It's about like rethinking the way that nature is going to look and the way our relationship to nature is going to work in the future. And that is really provocative, but it's hard to really wrap our brain around it. And it's hard to open that, conversation. So I find that kind of imagery, I hope can start a conversation, can ask a question of like, what is it that we want from our technology? I don't think that most people would say that they want like totally bizarre, like redesigned animals. But I think it's worth having that conversation, and that kind of imagery. I think, yeah, I don't think that we should fear that conversation, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I don't think that we should kind of shut off that kind of like whimsical kind of side, and we should sort of like engage with like, what is the disquiet that might cause.
You gave us a really good example before about was it fertilizer or pesticide? I forget which one. One way in which
Fertilizer, yeah.
You're right. So one way in which synthetic biology could certainly be a massive improvement on the artificial fertilizers we use just now, which we know cause all sorts of systemic problems and problems for the soil ultimately. And I know you've also been involved in another project that I found fascinating when I read about the flower. Could you tell us what you did with the flower to help bring this idea of synthetic biology to life?
Sure. So I have worked a lot with artists and designers in my work, in my career. I think that artists are really good at kind of challenging the way that we think about science and technology, and the kind of ways that we think about the social impacts and implications and the social like interconnectedness of technologies. I think like that image on the cover of The Economist. I think that great artwork, can kind of expose those sort of interconnections and questions. And so I really like working with artists to show what's possible, but also show what's complicated about technology. And so at Ginkgo, a lot of our work, especially a few years ago, was working with companies like flavors and fragrance companies that use source a lot of molecules, like fragrance and flavor molecules, from plants. And they were looking for ways to be able to make those kinds of products sustainably through fermentation. So engineer yeast to be able to reprogram the yeast's DNA with some of those plant genes. So now the yeast, while they're growing and brewing kind of beer, are actually brewing perfume. Does that make sense? Sort of like re-engineering yeast to be producing some of these molecules that are made normally in plants, as a way to kind of source those ingredients. And so when we were talking to the flavors and fragrance companies, often they really saw us as these kind of like faceless suppliers. They wanted us to kind of be in the background, like but we saw the potential for synthetic biology as a kind of creative opportunity too. Like what might become possible that was never before possible with fragrance or with any other kinds of industry, if you have synthetic biology, if you have these tools to be able to redesign biology. And so one of the ideas that we had was, well, what if you could smell a plant that actually had gone extinct? What if you could bring back that smell and experiencing it again? That's something that's only possible through biotechnology, where we were able to actually, where you might be able to, was the question that we asked 5 years ago, like, could you find the DNA of a plant that went extinct, re-engineer that sequence of DNA into into a yeast and then start producing those molecules that made it smell. And that was actually something that we did. It took many years. We found a specimen of a plant that went extinct, several plants that went extinct at the Harvard herbarium, and sequenced some of their DNA in collaboration with UC Santa Cruz, their paleogenomics lab. And then we're able to redesign and re-engineer fragrance genes from those plants into yeast. And then collaborated with artists, Sissel Tolas, who's a smell artist and researcher, and Daisy Ginsburg, who's a designer and artist who really multidisciplinary approach to thinking about technologies and the future of technology, and worked with them to bring that to life as a smell and as a way to kind of experience new technologies and to ask questions about nature and technology and humans, right? Like humans were the reason why those plants went extinct. Humans are also like going to be maybe part of the way we might smell them again, and that future and past and how they all connect. Like that's a very artistic and poetic set of questions, but I think it also points to what technology might be like in the future.
We had a question come in from Seth online who's asking, how do you explain synthetic biology in a way that his grandfather might understand? And furthermore, is it important that you're able to? Or is this the type of technology that doesn't need to be put into the public eye?
Oh, is there a technology that doesn't need to be put into the public eye? I think that it is really hard to be able to make to make it make sense to everyone and to understand what makes sense to everybody or what would make sense to everybody sorry, that came out a little bit confusing, but I think it's hard, right, to especially as a scientist, like we're trained to talk to other scientists. The more jargon you use, I think often like the better, and I think that's something that over the past 10 years now I've been trying to really to change for myself personally and for the way that I think about how we communicate synthetic biology. So I would love to be able to explain it to your grandfather, to anybody's grandfather. I think the ways to make it, like, to have that conversation really depends on what kinds of things that you're interested in, right? I think there's a way in to talk about synthetic biology starting from brewing and the starter cultures that Christine was talking about, right? Like, I think fermentation is a technique. That's a kind of biotechnology. You mentioned my cheese project, like making cheese, right? Transforming milk into cheese. That's an ancient form of biotechnology. You have to cultivate these microbes. You have to think about the molecules that they're making, and increasingly there's genetic engineering involved in cheese making too. The enzymes that are involved in hardening the curds, that rennet that comes from a calf stomach. That's something that's now actually being produced by fungi, genetically engineered fungi that take the gene from a calf and put it into the fungus, so you can actually produce that enzyme in a way that doesn't require killing calves, so you can make vegetarian cheese. And so that's I think one way in. And so maybe that's one tactic to kind of talk about, like, to connect it to kind of something more familiar and historical, but then kind of, again, connect it to what are the molecular techniques or these things that are a little bit more unfamiliar or difficult to visualize, but are sort of part of the same process.
What do you make of Cindy's question here online? She said, shouldn't we be using natural resources better rather than genetically modifying and growing things in labs?
All of the above. Christine, do you have something to say there too?
No, exactly. I think it's just another, I mean, all of these solutions can help us to, use natural resources better and are all going to be part of the patchworks of solutions that we need. And that's what I was trying to get to about, it's not one or the other. It's not an either or conversation and how we're going to feed the planet. It's going to be an and conversation. And, in our Thought for Food community, we've had some really interesting discussions around the future of protein, which of course is very, analogous to the world that you're living in too, Christina, because it's like there are now, meat products being grown in fermentation chambers. There's obviously a livestock, whole industry built around this. And there's different ways that you can cultivate livestock, right? There's like much more sustainable ways. There's industrial ways and regenerative ways, etc. And I think like what's really interesting, and then there's the whole plant-based movement too, right? And so there, do we even need meat in the first place? And should we rather be sourcing our protein from vegetables and legumes, etc.? And for me, it was a very like interesting discussion to witness in our Thought for Food community because it was rich and in terms of like the nuance that people were uncovering. And it was also like very global. We had, people from California, from India, from Uganda, from Nebraska, all engaging in this conversation with different perspectives and having that aha moment that it doesn't have to be an and, it can be all of these. And they play a different role in various markets and in various cultures, etc.
Okay. My next question just evaded my brain, actually, come to say it. Christine, you've talked a lot about local being a solution, of course, and well, bearing in mind you've just given us the response that it's an and. If we move toward more lab-based solutions, does that not take away an element of the local?
I just want to like clarify. I said locally relevant and culturally relevant. So I don't want to get into this like, oh, we're all sourcing local. You know what I mean? Because it could be like in the US that you're, dealing with a vast market. And I'm not just like advocating for farmers markets as the solution here. Is I just wanted to clarify. It's relevant to the culture and the context of your food system that you're, innovating within.
So you've given us, between you, quite a lot of ideas for ways that the food system can get a shot in the arm. But ultimately, what is the goal for the food system? What would a healthy food system look like in, say, 20, 30 years?
Do you want to go first,
I'll go with you
Christina?
first, Christine, because you're on camera.
I'm on the screen. Okay.
Yeah.
So, like, I think about this a lot, but again, for me, a healthy food system is one that is not focused on like the what, but like the how we're getting there. And again, just like to reiterate this point, it's going to be diverse solutions that have outcomes that are like unequivocally better than where we are today, right? Where we're minimizing negative externalities, and that are nourishing people and replenishing natural resources and getting us to a better optimal state of being. But what does that look like is for me less important than like how we're going to get there. And that's why I'm very much focused on this kind of like empowering diverse innovators and diverse locations around the world to come up with a multitude of solutions that are based on, getting us to better outcomes. And it's not just going to be a silver bullet solution. And I think that I'm, a big fan of synthetic biology and biotech. I think that's going to play a big role. But I don't think that's going to be everything. When you look at some markets around the world, it's, also about like I said, it can be, livestock can play an important role, or, smallholder practices, etc. But just two small builds on that. I do think syn bio and biotech can be relevant for smallholders. So I just want to make sure that I don't want this to be just like, oh, this is only something for, tech-driven developed countries. I don't think that that is the case at all. And then the other thing is that I believe that everything that we do as human beings, everything that we make can be created by using biological processes. So in going to like how to paint this vision for like your grandfather or, a maybe non-scientific audience, it's like the fossil fuel era is going to move to a biological based era, and we'll be creating materials and foods and everything, not just in fermentation chambers, but based on designing biological systems. And so it's designing biology, to do things that in the past we had an extractive model around, and now it doesn't have to be extractive. It can be, replenishing to the world. That's the future of food, I think.
Christina, just shifting away a little bit from the food system, obviously around us in the news is the coronavirus, can't get it out of the news just now. What role can synthetic biology play in dealing with a virus like corona?
Well, I was just actually reading like Gates Foundation is taking a very like synbio-based approach. I think like there's going to be a lot of, testing approaches that will be based on SynBio, and vaccine development approaches that will be based on SynBio. One of the things that I love, again, because I focus a lot on the how, not just the what, is like University of Washington is using their Fold It platform game, which is like you fold proteins, you know, in this crowdsourced game. They have one now for coronavirus where they're looking at how you can like block that in human cells. And for me, like that is something that's so cool about like how SynBiology is changing how science is done through this like open, accessible, and interdisciplinary kind of, you know, approach that they're taking, that Christina is like at the forefront of leading. And I think like in this space, like, you know, coronavirus, like there could be a non-expert that plays a major role in solving this. We saw that with the AIDS virus a few years ago using that very same Fold It platform. So I hope the audience will go check it out and use your downtime to play that game instead of just reading clickbait articles. Everyone can play a role in potentially solving this. So
Thanks,
like I said, I really am attracted to this culture.
Thanks, Christine. Christina, on the
Sure.
coronavirus point?
Yeah, I can add. I think I really like what you're saying, Christine. I think about this how rather than the what. I think for the past 20 years, I think synthetic biologists have been really focused on this like question of building tools and platforms and communities that might enable like biology and biotechnology to flourish in new ways. Because I think everybody recognizes like biology does things better than us. Biology is better at chemistry. Biology is better at like doing things that are renewable, regenerative, that are these kind of beautiful closed loop systems. There are no externalities. There is no waste in biology. And so building the kinds of tools that will enable our technologies to look a little bit more biological, I think is something that many people in this community share. And so that's really important to me and to synthetic biology and to Ginkgo. I think when it comes to something like responding to viruses and like new kinds of like emerging diseases and those kinds of threats, I think like there absolutely are ways that like, yeah, that how like an infrastructure to like rapidly sequence a lot of DNA, rapidly be able to like diagnose and respond to new emerging threats. That's really important. To rapidly develop new kinds of vaccines. That's something that a lot of people in the synthetic biology community are working on. I think Moderna is a company here in Boston. They are a synthetic biology company, and they're developing new kinds of vaccines. I think they're one of the first people to have a vaccine for coronavirus in going into tests and trials. And so that speed, the kind of new approaches that's coming out of this community, and that's really important. I think what's also really been interesting to see and both kind of like, yeah, scary, but also like important to see what's happening with coronavirus is really how interconnected we all are. When you see the kind of transmission, that how fast it happens across the world, but also the kinds of things that we're seeing, like the way that supply chains are responding, the way that people are actually like supplies of really important medicines are being restricted because of like, yeah, how we manufacture things and how that's been globalized. So thinking about how we might make our systems more resilient through manufacturing in different ways using biology, those are questions that you might start to think about and something that biology might be able to play a role in. But I think, yeah, I think that this time, like where we're at now, it's really scary and I think really important for us to be, considering all these ways that we are so truly connected and so intertwined and connected with nature too. Yeah, go ahead, Christine.
I just told us to kind of like build on each other's, you know, points. I really love the point you were making about like how to make supply chains more resilient, because it goes a little bit to what also excites me about the culture of SynBio is this like democratized innovation. And like ostensibly everyone could have like fermentation chambers in their home. Now I know that's like something that's still a bit far off, like when you talk about some of the more advanced things, not just making beer, but like, you know, there could be a future, right, where we are producing a lot of these materials and foods, etc., like all over the world for cheaply and without waste, like you rightly said. And so I think that's also really like exciting that there is this kind of like potential future where there are less limiting factors and infrastructure requirements, etc., for some of the solutions that we need.
Christine and Christina, it's been a lovely chat. Thank you very much for introducing us to some of these great ideas that are leading the way in revolutionizing our food system. If you've enjoyed this talk with Christine and Christina, then you'll enjoy everything else that's going on with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's live broadcast series. Check us out on ellenmacarthurfoundation.org for a whole host of events that have taken part today and tomorrow. Anything you've missed, you can catch up on. My name's been Colin Webster. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.